The air smells of stone dust and morning rain when the first servants enter through the eastern gate, long before sunrise, long before the world believes the palace has awakened. Their footsteps echo against marble that cost more than entire villages, past gilded doorframes that required 3 years of a master craftsman's life to complete. They carry brooms, buckets, kindling. They know passages the architects never drew, rooms that exist only to serve other rooms, staircases that descend into darkness where no visitor will ever stand. The beauty above depends entirely on the structure below, and this has always been the arrangement, unspoken, immutable, woven into the very mortar that holds these walls together. The Royal Palace of Madrid rises from the western edge of the Spanish capital like a statement carved in stone, a declaration of permanence in a world that has never stopped changing. 3,418 rooms spread across 135,000 square meters, forming a perfect square that encloses courtyards, chapels, throne rooms, and galleries. The southern facade stretches nearly 130 meters, each window precisely aligned, each column measured to the millimeter. The entire structure designed to communicate one truth above all others. Here resides power that cannot be questioned, wealth that cannot be counted, authority that descends directly from heaven to earth. But stand in the basement corridors at dawn, and you encounter a different palace entirely. Here, the ceilings drop low, the floors remain bare stone, the air grows cold even in summer. Networks of passages snake beneath the marble above, connecting kitchens to storerooms, coal cellars to furnace rooms, servant quarters to laundry halls. The palace that presents itself to the world as unity and order reveals itself below as organized chaos, a city beneath a city, where hundreds of people move constantly to create the illusion of effortless grandeur above. Every candelabra that burns requires someone to trim wicks and replace candles. Every fireplace that glows warm in winter requires someone to haul coal up from the cellars. Every dinner served on porcelain painted with the royal crest requires someone to wash, dry, and return each piece to its precise location in the pantry. The visible palace could not exist for a single day without the invisible one. Yet the invisible palace is never acknowledged, never celebrated, never included in the official histories that record dates and dynasties. The palace stands where it does because of fire. On Christmas Eve, 1734, the old Alcázar that had served Spanish monarchs since the 16th century burned for 3 days, the flames visible from every corner of Madrid, the heat so intense that stone walls cracked and collapsed into ash. King Philip V stood in the Plaza de Oriente and watched centuries of history disappear into smoke. Paintings by Velázquez and Titian, tapestries from Flanders, furniture carved from American mahogany, archives documenting the conquest of empires, all reduced to cinders. But Philip did not mourn for long. Within weeks, he had summoned architects, engineers, and craftsmen. The old palace had been a layered accumulation, rooms added across generations without unified design. The new palace would be different. It would be fireproof, constructed entirely of stone and brick, without a single structural beam of wood. It would be vast enough to contain every function of government and court. It would announce to Europe that Spain, despite losing its great empire in the wars of succession, despite economic decline and political humiliation, remained a power that could build monuments to rival Versailles. Philip V was a man who spent his final years in almost complete darkness, curtains drawn against daylight, moving through his own palaces like a ghost. Melancholy consumed him, episodes of what we would now recognize as severe depression rendering him unable to govern for months at a time. His second wife, Isabel Farnese, effectively ruled in his absence, making decisions, appointing ministers, directing policy. It was Isabel who pushed hardest for the new palace, understanding that physical grandeur could compensate for political weakness, that architecture could restore prestige that military defeats had eroded. She envisioned not merely a residence, but a theater of power, where every ambassador who entered would immediately understand Spain's place in the hierarchy of nations. The king chose Filippo Juvara, the greatest architect then working in Europe, a man who had designed palaces for the House of Savoy, churches that redefined Baroque space. Juvara arrived in Madrid in 1735 and immediately proposed something breathtaking, a palace that would occupy the entire hill overlooking the Manzanares River, extending west from the old Alcazar site, rising on terraces and arcades, visible from every approach to the city. His drawings showed a structure larger than anything built in Spain since the Escorial, a palace that would take 50 years to complete and require resources the Spanish treasury no longer possessed. Juvara understood this, but he also understood that his role was to dream, not to calculate. He died less than a year after arriving in Madrid, fever taking him before construction even began. The commission passed to his assistant, Giovanni Battista Sacchetti, a competent architect, but not a visionary. Sacchetti took Juvara's vast horizontal design and compressed it, turning fantasy into something that might actually be built within a single lifetime. He preserved the square plan, the central courtyard, the monumental staircases, but reduced the overall footprint by half. Even this scaled-down version would require decades and consume wealth on a scale difficult to comprehend. Construction began in April 1738. The first task was foundation work, digging down through soil and bedrock to create a platform stable enough to support walls that would rise 50 meters high. Workers discovered that the hill was less solid than it appeared, layers of clay and loose stone requiring deeper excavation than planned. Engineers drove wooden piles into the earth, then poured limestone rubble and mortar to create a base that would not shift or settle. This foundation work alone took 2 years and employed over 500 men daily, laborers from Madrid and the surrounding provinces, working with picks and shovels, hauling baskets of earth up wooden ramps, descending each day into trenches that grew deeper and darker. The stone came from quarries in the Guadarrama Mountains, 30 kilometers northwest of Madrid. White limestone and gray granite, blocks weighing up to 3 tons each, cut by hand with saws and wedges, transported on wagons pulled by teams of oxen. The roads between the quarries and the city were rutted dirt tracks, impassable in winter when rains turned them to mud. Each wagon could carry only 1 or 2 blocks, meaning hundreds of trips, thousands of hours of slow movement across a landscape that offered no mercy to men or animals. Oxen died regularly, collapsing from exhaustion or breaking legs in potholes. The drivers slept beside their wagons, guarding the stone from thieves who would steal anything valuable, even raw granite that could be sold to smaller construction projects in the city. At the construction site, master masons directed teams of stonemasons who shaped each block to precise dimensions, using templates provided by Sacchetti's office. The tolerances were measured in millimeters, each stone cut to fit exactly into its designated position in the wall. There was no mortar strong enough to compensate for poor cutting. The weight of the structure depended on perfect alignment, stone resting on stone in a pattern that distributed force evenly across the entire base. A single miscalculation could create weakness that would only become apparent years later, cracks spreading through walls, lintels sagging, entire sections threatening collapse. The masons worked in teams of 8 to 12, each team assigned a specific section of wall, each man specializing in particular tasks. Some cut the rough blocks into rectangular shapes, others chiseled decorative details, rosettes and moldings that would frame windows and doors. The most skilled carved capitals for columns, acanthus leaves, and scroll work that required weeks of patient effort, working from drawings that specified every curve and shadow. These men earned wages 3 times higher than ordinary laborers, but their work destroyed their bodies. Stone dust filled their lungs, causing coughs that began as minor irritations and progressed over years into chronic breathlessness. Many masons died before 50, their hands twisted with arthritis, their hearing damaged by years of hammer blows against metal chisels. Inside the rising walls, carpenters constructed the floors, laying beams of chestnut and oak imported from the forests of northern Spain. These beams spanned rooms up to 15 meters wide, supporting floors finished with terracotta tiles and, in the most important rooms, marble. The marble came from quarries near Alicante and Tortosa, colored stone in shades of rose, green, and black, cut into geometric patterns that would eventually cover over 70,000 square meters of flooring. Transporting this much marble required a supply chain that involved not just quarries and wagons, but also ports and ships, coastal vessels carrying stone from Mediterranean quarries around the entire Iberian Peninsula to the port of Cadiz, then up the Guadalquivir River and overland to Madrid. A single shipment could take 6 months from quarry to construction site, and losses along the way were routine. Ships sank in storms, wagons overturned on mountain roads, crates were dropped and shattered in ports. By 1750, 12 years into construction, the palace had consumed the equivalent of 14 million silver reals, enough money to build and equip an entire naval fleet, enough to fund Spain's military operations in Italy for 3 years. The treasury struggled to maintain payments, sometimes delaying wages for months, causing labor unrest and work stoppages. Philip V did not live to see the walls rise above the second floor. He died in 1746, his final years spent in almost complete seclusion, his contribution to the palace reduced to the initial decision to build. His son, Ferdinand VI, inherited both the throne and the construction project, along with debts that had begun to destabilize the royal finances. Ferdinand had no interest in architecture or grandeur. He preferred music, employing the castrato singer Farinelli as a personal companion, paying him a salary larger than most ministers received. But he understood that abandoning the palace would be interpreted as weakness, an admission that Spain could not complete what it had begun. So construction continued, though at a slower pace, with periodic pauses when money ran short. The workers developed a rhythm to these interruptions, finding other employment during the idle months, returning when funds became available again. This start and stop pattern extended the timeline, but also embedded the palace deeper into Madrid's economy. Thousands of families depended on wages from the construction, shopkeepers and innkeepers relied on workers spending their earnings, entire neighborhoods organized themselves around the daily movement of men and materials to and from the site. The palace required specialists whose skills existed nowhere else in Spain. Stucco artists from Italy, experts in creating the ornamental plasterwork that would cover ceilings and walls, mixing lime and marble dust with such precision that the finished surface resembled carved stone. Fresco painters who could work on wet plaster, creating images that would become part of the wall itself, permanent and unchangeable. Gilders who applied gold leaf to wooden frames and decorative elements, brushing on layers of adhesive made from rabbit skin glue, laying tissue-thin sheets of gold that required absolutely steady hands in windless rooms. Each of these crafts demanded years of apprenticeship, knowledge passed from master to student in workshops where techniques were guarded secrets, valuable enough to determine whether a family prospered or starved. Giovanni Battista Tiepolo arrived in Madrid in 1762, already recognized as the greatest fresco painter in Europe, a Venetian master who had decorated churches and palaces across Italy and Germany. King Charles III, who had succeeded his half-brother Ferdinand, commissioned Tiepolo to paint the ceiling of the throne room, a space measuring 30 meters by 23, the largest single room in the palace. Tiepolo designed an allegory of the Spanish monarchy, a swirling composition of gods and mortals, clouds and sunlight, painted directly onto the curved vault of the ceiling. He worked on scaffolding erected 40 meters above the floor, lying on his back for hours each day, his arm extended overhead, brush moving across wet plaster that would dry within hours, allowing no corrections, no second chances. The throne room ceiling took Tiepolo and his assistants nearly 2 years to complete. They mixed their own pigments, grinding minerals and earth into powder, combining them with water and binders according to formulas that varied for each color. Blues came from lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan, a stone so expensive that it cost more per ounce than gold. Reds came from cinnabar and vermilion, toxic minerals that caused tremors and madness in painters who worked with them for years. Tiepolo's assistants prepared hundreds of small batches of plaster each day, carrying them up to the scaffolding in buckets, applying them to sections of ceiling that Tiepolo had already sketched in charcoal. He painted quickly, confidently, each brushstroke visible in the final work, the entire composition unified by a technique refined over 50 years of practice. When the scaffolding finally came down and the court saw the finished ceiling for the first time, the effect was overwhelming. The painted sky seemed to open the room to infinity, figures floating in space that appeared both solid and weightless, light streaming from sources that did not exist. Visitors reported feeling dizzy, disoriented, unable to judge distances or dimensions. This was precisely the intention. The throne room was designed to destabilize, to remind everyone who entered that they stood in a space beyond ordinary reality, where a king sat in judgment over mortals under the gaze of gods. But while Tiepolo painted allegories of eternal monarchy, the actual operations of the palace revealed something far more mundane. By 1764, when the royal family officially moved from the old temporary residence into the new palace, the annual operating costs already exceeded 3 million reals. Staff numbered over 800 people, from the highest court officials to the lowest scullery maids, each assigned specific duties, each receiving wages that ranged from generous to barely survivable. The structure of palace employment replicated the larger structure of Spanish society, rigid hierarchies determining who could speak to whom, who could enter which rooms, who ate meat and who ate bread. The positions closest to the king carried tremendous prestige and almost no actual labor. Gentlemen of the chamber, grandes of Spain who held the right to hand the king his shirt or hold the basin while he washed, received thousands of reales annually for duties that required a few minutes each day. These were sinecures, rewards for loyalty or birth, positions that conveyed status rather than income, since the men who held them already possessed vast estates. Further down the hierarchy, positions involved real work but still came with privileges. The head chef commanded a kitchen staff of over 60, with authority over budgets that could feed a small town, discretion over menus that reflected not just the king's taste, but political calculations about what message a particular dinner would send to foreign ambassadors. Below the visible court, the palace employed an army of workers whose names appeared in account books, but never in chronicles or memoirs. Laundresses who washed linens in water heated over wood fires, their hands permanently reddened and cracked from lye soap. Chambermaids who emptied chamber pots, scraped candle wax from floors, polished mirrors until arms ached. Footmen who carried messages and packages, walking kilometers each day through corridors and staircases, their legs developing the muscled thickness of professional runners. Coal handlers who spent their days in basement passages, shoveling fuel into bins, breathing air thick with dust, emerging at day's end, looking like creatures made of soot. The palace consumed resources at a rate that would seem impossible if not documented in meticulous account books that survive in archives. During winter months, when over 200 fireplaces burned continuously, coal consumption reached 12 tons per day. This coal came from mines in Asturias, transported overland in wagons that traveled for weeks, delivered to palace coal yards where workers sorted it by quality, storing the best for royal apartments, lesser grades for servants' quarters and kitchens. Water came from wells and cisterns, raised by hand pumps operated by men who worked in shifts, filling tanks that gravity-fed to fountains and kitchens. Before modern plumbing, maintaining adequate water supply for a palace this size required continuous labor. Gallons carried in buckets up staircases, distributed to rooms where nobles expected to find water for washing without ever considering how it arrived. Lighting presented another endless challenge. Candles provided illumination in an era before gas or electricity, and a palace that operated through evening social events and late-night government meetings consumed candles at an astonishing rate. The palace chandelier workshop employed 12 full-time craftsmen who did nothing but maintain candelabras, replacing burned candles, cleaning wax drippings, polishing brass and crystal. A single state dinner in the main dining hall required over 400 candles, each burning for approximately 3 hours, meaning that servants had to replace them midway through the evening, working quickly and quietly to avoid disrupting conversation. The annual candle budget exceeded 100,000 reals, purchasing tallow candles for service areas, beeswax candles for public rooms, and specially scented candles for the royal apartments, each type produced by different suppliers who competed for contracts that could make or destroy their businesses. Charles III brought to the palace an obsession with order that bordered on compulsion. He established schedules for every activity, regulated the movements of servants through the building, created detailed protocols for meals, audiences, ceremonies. He rose at the same hour each morning, ate the same breakfast, took the same walk through the gardens regardless of weather. This regularity extended to the palace staff, whose days were divided into precise increments, their duties outlined in regulations that specified not just what they should do, but exactly when and how. The intent was efficiency, but the effect was suffocating. Workers lived in a perpetual state of evaluation, supervisors watching to ensure that every task was completed according to procedure, punishments ranging from wage deductions to dismissal for violations that might seem trivial to outsiders, but represented intolerable disorder to a king who believed that proper governance began with proper domestic management. The gardens surrounding the palace became another project consuming vast resources and labor. Charles commissioned the transformation of the rough hillside west of the palace into a formal garden modeled on Italian and French designs, with geometric parterres, fountains, statuary, and gravel paths. Gardeners dug out the existing terrain, imported topsoil from the Tajo River Valley, planted thousands of trees and shrubs brought from nurseries across Spain and beyond. Orange trees from Valencia, cypresses from Italy, roses from France, each requiring specific soil conditions, watering schedules, pruning techniques. The head gardener oversaw a staff of 40, men who worked year-round maintaining plantings, raking gravel paths, trimming hedges into precise shapes that had to be maintained weekly during the growing season. Water for the gardens came through a system of pipes and channels, fed by mountain streams diverted from their natural courses, an engineering project that took 5 years to complete and involved building aqueducts across valleys, tunneling through hills, creating reservoirs that would maintain pressure during dry months. The fountains alone required continuous maintenance, limestone deposits clogging pipes, frost-cracking joints in winter, leaks developing that could waste thousands of gallons before being detected and repaired. A specialized crew worked exclusively on fountain maintenance, men who understood hydraulics, who could calculate water pressure and flow rates, who spent their days wet and cold, crawling through channels that were barely wide enough for a human body. The cost of maintaining the palace and grounds approached 4 million reals annually by the 1770s, a figure that represented roughly 8% of the entire royal budget. This did not include extraordinary expenses like major repairs, new construction projects, or the purchase of artworks and furnishings. The Spanish treasury, already strained by military commitments and colonial administration, struggled to meet these obligations. Ministers proposed economies, suggesting that certain rooms could remain unfurnished, that staff could be reduced, that maintenance could be deferred. Charles rejected most of these suggestions, understanding that a palace that appeared shabby or understaffed would undermine the very purpose it served. The palace existed to project power, and power depended on perception, on creating an impression of unlimited resources, effortless magnificence. Yet beneath this facade, the palace was always on the edge of dysfunction. Delayed payments meant that suppliers refused to deliver coal or candles until arrears were settled, causing shortages that forced staff to ration fuel and lighting. Unpaid workers sometimes sabotaged equipment or stole supplies, small acts of resistance against a system that treated them as interchangeable parts. The rigid hierarchy created inefficiencies, messages taking hours to travel from one department to another, because protocol required that they pass through multiple layers of authority. A request for something as simple as additional firewood in a royal apartment might require approvals from a chamberlain, a steward, and a quartermaster, each creating documentation, each introducing delay. The French Revolution arrived in Spain not as armies, but as ideas. Texts smuggled across the Pyrenees, pamphlets printed in secret, conversations held in cafes and salons where people began to question the foundations of monarchy, aristocracy, and the social order that sustained them. Charles IV, who inherited the throne in 1788, lacked his father's discipline and intelligence. He preferred hunting to governing, spending months at rural palaces, leaving state business to his wife Maria Luisa and her favorite Manuel Godoy, a guards officer who rose from obscurity to become prime minister through a combination of charm, ambition, and the Queen's patronage. Under Charles IV, the palace became a stage for intrigue and factionalism. Nobles competed for access and influence, bribing servants for information about private conversations, forming alliances that shifted with each rumor of favor, gained or lost. The palace staff found themselves caught in these conflicts, pressured to report on their employers, to carry messages between conspirators, to maintain appearances while knowing that the authority they served was hollow. When Napoleon's armies invaded Spain in 1808, forcing Charles to abdicate in favor of his son Ferdinand, and then forcing Ferdinand to abdicate in favor of Napoleon's brother Joseph, the palace workers watched dynasties collapse while continuing to perform the same tasks, lighting the same candles, serving the same dinners, because buildings require maintenance regardless of who claims to rule. Joseph Bonaparte attempted to govern from the palace, but Madrileños never accepted him. They called him Pepe Botella, Joe Bottle, mocking him as a drunkard despite his actual temperance. The palace became a fortress, French troops stationed in courtyards, sentries posted at every entrance. The Spanish staff faced impossible choices: continue working and be seen as collaborators, or refuse and lose income their families desperately needed. Most stayed, performing their duties with mechanical precision, offering neither loyalty nor resistance, simply surviving. When Wellington's armies finally drove the French from Madrid in 1812, the palace had suffered damage from military occupation, rooms stripped of furnishings to create barracks, walls scarred by gunfire, gardens trampled by cavalry exercises. Ferdinand VII returned to Spain in 1814 as a supposed champion of liberty. then immediately restored absolute monarchy, persecuting liberals who had supported constitutional government during his absence. The palace under Ferdinand became a place of paranoia and repression. He trusted no one, suspected everyone, maintained networks of informers who reported on court officials, ministers, servants. The palace staff learned to speak carefully, to avoid any comment that might be construed as political, to perform their duties while revealing nothing of their thoughts or feelings. The cost of maintaining the palace remained enormous, but now those costs competed with the expenses of internal security, payments to informers, funding for a police apparatus designed to suppress dissent. The palace by this time had become impossible to heat adequately. Fireplaces designed for the 18th century could not warm rooms with ceilings 6 meters high, windows that leaked cold air around frames that had warped and shrunk over decades. Servants worked through winter wearing multiple layers of clothing, their breath visible as they moved through corridors where temperature rarely rose above freezing. The royal family retreated to smaller, more easily heated apartments, leaving vast sections of the palace empty and unheated, where frost formed on windows and dampness created conditions perfect for rot and decay. Maintenance crews fought a losing battle against deterioration, patching leaks, replacing rotted floorboards, scraping mold from walls. Ferdinand died in 1833, triggering a succession crisis that became civil war. His daughter Isabella was 3 years old, too young to rule, her claim disputed by Ferdinand's brother Carlos, who believed that women should not inherit the throne. The resulting Carlist wars dragged on for decades, draining the treasury, dividing Spanish society, turning the palace into a symbolic prize that both sides claimed to defend. Isabella eventually ascended the throne, but her reign was chaotic, marked by political instability, military coups, financial crises. The palace during her reign deteriorated further, repairs deferred indefinitely, staff positions left unfilled when workers retired or died. By mid-century, portions of the palace had become genuinely dangerous. Ceilings sagged, plaster cracking and falling. Staircases developed gaps where stone had shifted. The smell of rot pervaded entire wings, fungus growing in walls where water infiltrated through failing roofs. Engineers surveyed the building and reported that without major intervention, sections would become uninhabitable within a decade. But the treasury could not fund comprehensive repairs. Instead, workers implemented triage, shoring up the most critical damage, closing off rooms that were beyond immediate help, hoping that somehow resources would become available before collapse became inevitable. Isabella was deposed in 1868, fleeing to France as revolutionaries proclaimed Spain a republic. The palace stood empty for periods during the Republican experiment, then briefly housed King Amadeo of Savoy. An Italian prince offered the Spanish throne who accepted, discovered the impossibility of the situation, and abdicated after 2 years. The palace during this period became a museum of abandoned grandeur, tourists paying small fees to walk through throne rooms and galleries, gawking at Tiepolo's frescoes and Velázquez's paintings, while guides who had once been court servants narrated histories of dynasties that seemed increasingly irrelevant. The Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1874 under Alfonso XII, Isabella's son, who returned from exile to find a palace that required immediate attention. Alfonso funded a comprehensive restoration program, the first systematic maintenance since construction, completed over a century earlier. Engineers stabilized foundations, roofers replaced thousands of tiles, plasterers repaired ceilings, painters restored frescoes that had darkened under layers of soot and grime. This work took 5 years and cost over 6 million pesetas, an enormous sum that Alfonso justified by arguing that the palace represented national heritage, a monument that transcended whoever happened to occupy the throne. The restoration revealed just how much continuous maintenance such a building required. Every material had a lifespan, every system eventually failed, and a palace this size meant that something was always deteriorating, always demanding attention. The restoration employed over 300 workers at peak, specialists in stonework, carpentry, metalwork, each repairing damage according to techniques that honored original craftsmanship. But even this massive effort could not address everything. Estimates suggested that fully restoring and modernizing the palace would cost triple what Alfonso was willing to spend, meaning that the restored palace was still compromised, still carrying deferred maintenance into the future. Alfonso died young, in 1885, leaving the throne to a son born after his death. Spain entered the 20th century under a regency, then under Alfonso XIII, a king who would preside over the loss of Spain's last colonies, military disasters in Morocco, social unrest that would eventually explode into civil war. The palace during the early 20th century was modernized in ways that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. Electric lighting replaced candles in most rooms, though installation required threading wires through walls without damaging historical fabric. Central heating systems were installed in some sections, boilers and radiators providing warmth more efficiently than fireplaces, though the system was never comprehensive, leaving portions of the palace still dependent on coal fires. Telephones connected key offices, allowing communication that once required messengers to walk through kilometers of corridors. These modernizations reduced labor requirements in some areas while creating new specialized positions. Electricians maintained lighting systems, boiler operators ran heating plants, telephone operators connected calls. The palace staff shrank from over 800 to roughly 500, but the remaining positions required different skills, technical knowledge rather than simple physical labor. The palace was becoming a hybrid, historical monument managed with modern technology, each innovation creating tensions between preservation and practicality. How do you install electrical conduits without destroying 18th century plasterwork? How do you improve fire safety without altering spaces designed for different purposes? These questions had no perfect answers, only compromises that balanced competing values. The Spanish Civil War brought violence to the palace steps. Madrid became a Republican stronghold, the palace a symbol of everything the Republic opposed. But Republican authorities protected it, recognizing that whatever political system emerged, the palace represented cultural heritage worth preserving. They removed the most valuable artworks, transporting paintings and sculptures to secure locations, creating inventories that would later prove crucial for recovering pieces that disappeared during the chaos. The palace itself suffered relatively minor damage, some broken windows, bullet marks on exterior walls, but nothing catastrophic. The greater danger was neglect, 3 years during which maintenance nearly ceased, roofs leaked unrepaired, heating systems failed, gardens grew wild. Franco's victory in 1939 restored order but not monarchy. Franco ruled as dictator, using the palace occasionally for state ceremonies, but preferring other residences for daily business. The palace during the Franco era became primarily a museum, open to the public on designated days, the entrance fees contributing modestly to maintenance costs. The staff during this period performed a strange double function, maintaining a palace for a king who did not exist, preserving rooms that no one inhabited, performing duties dictated by protocol that served no actual purpose beyond continuity itself. They polished silver that would never be used, laundered linens for beds no one would sleep in, maintained a fiction of readiness for a restoration that seemed increasingly unlikely. Franco died in 1975, and Spain transitioned to democracy under King Juan Carlos, grandson of Alfonso XIII. Juan Carlos chose not to live in the royal palace, finding it too large, too formal, too burdened with history. Instead, the royal family resided at the smaller Palacio de la Zarzuela outside Madrid, using the royal palace only for official ceremonies and state dinners. This decision transformed the palace entirely. It became fully a museum and state building, no longer a residence in any meaningful sense. The transition required restructuring the staff, reducing household servants while increasing conservators, tour guides, security personnel. The modern palace operates under the management of Patrimonio Nacional, a state agency responsible for properties historically owned by the Spanish crown. The annual budget approaches 40 million euros, funding a staff of approximately 450, including conservators, curators, administrators, security guards, maintenance workers, gardeners, and guides. Income from tourism covers roughly 60% of operating costs, around 24 million euros annually from ticket sales and related activities. The remaining 40% comes from state funding, a subsidy that faces scrutiny whenever budget pressures intensify. Conservation work is continuous and expensive. Stone facades require regular cleaning to remove pollution damage, centuries of grime that eats into limestone and granite. Interior restoration proceeds room by room, specialists working for months on individual ceilings, repairing plaster, stabilizing frescoes, cleaning gilt without removing the patina that indicates age. These projects require techniques that barely existed a generation ago: scientific analysis of materials, computer modeling of structural stresses, climate control systems that maintain temperature and humidity within narrow ranges to prevent damage from expansion and contraction. The throne room where Tiepolo painted his masterpiece now requires environmental monitoring that would astonish its original inhabitants. Sensors track temperature, humidity, and light levels continuously, feeding data to computers that analyze conditions and alert conservators to any variations that might threaten the fresco. The room is never fully lit anymore. Controlled lighting protects pigments from fading, meaning that visitors see the ceiling in dimness that obscures some of Tiepolo's subtlest effects. This is the compromise of preservation. To save the painting for the future means accepting that present viewers experience something different from what 18th century courtiers saw under the blaze of hundreds of candles. The gardens that once employed 40 full-time gardeners now operate with a staff of 12, using modern equipment that allows fewer workers to maintain larger areas. But efficiency comes with aesthetic costs. Historical plantings that required intensive hand care have been replaced with species that demand less attention, geometric parterres simplified to reduce labor, gravel paths paved for easier maintenance. The gardens remain beautiful, but they represent a contemporary interpretation of historical design, a version edited for practicality rather than a faithful recreation of original intent. Tourism shapes every aspect of palace operations. Over 1 million visitors pass through each year, their tickets funding conservation, their presence requiring infrastructure that intrudes on historical spaces. Emergency exits, lighting, signage, barriers that protect fragile furnishings while guiding crowds through designated routes. All these interventions alter the palace, turning it into something it never was: a public building designed for mass access. Staff manage a constant tension between access and preservation, knowing that every visitor contributes wear, tracked-in dirt, humidity from breath, vibration from footsteps, yet also understanding that public support depends on public access. The palace in the 21st century faces challenges its builders could not have imagined. Climate change brings more intense storms, heavier rainfall that overwhelms historical drainage systems, temperature extremes that stress materials designed for different conditions. Pollution from Madrid's traffic deposits chemicals on stone surfaces, accelerating erosion. Underground infrastructure fails, sewer lines over a century-old collapsing, electrical systems installed decades ago, no longer meeting code, all requiring replacement in ways that minimize damage to historical fabric. Funding remains perpetually uncertain. Economic downturns reduce tourism, cutting revenue precisely when state budgets face the greatest pressure. The palace competes for resources with schools, hospitals, social services, worthy causes that serve living people with immediate needs. Justifying millions of euros for ceiling restoration or garden maintenance requires arguments about cultural heritage, national identity, tourism economics, abstract concepts that struggle against concrete human needs. The staff has learned to make these arguments, to quantify the palace's economic impact, to frame conservation as investment rather than expense. But the underlying tension never disappears. The workers who keep the palace functioning today inhabit a world transformed from their 18th century predecessors, yet connected by continuous threads of purpose and practice. A conservator repairing damaged gilt uses techniques not fundamentally different from those employed by original craftsmen, the same rabbit skin glue, the same gold leaf, the same patient application of material to substrate. A gardener pruning a tree follows principles established centuries ago, encouraging growth in some directions, restricting it in others, shaping the plant to serve aesthetic goals that transcend individual lifespans. The work continues because work must continue. The palace survives not through admiration, but through effort. Who paid for this dream? The question has no single answer because the dream never finished being paid for. 18th century laborers paid with their health and years of their lives, quarrying stone, hauling materials, breathing dust that shortened their time on earth. Taxpayers paid, their levies funding construction and operation, resources diverted from other purposes to build a monument that most would never enter. The treasury paid, accumulating debts that constrained other spending, military and administrative functions competing with palace budgets. Servants paid, working long hours for modest wages, their labor invisible but essential, their names forgotten while the palace remembered only monarchs and architects. The dream continues to cost, continues to require payment. Every year, conservators make decisions about what can be restored and what must wait, allocating finite resources among infinite needs. Every year, tourists pay admission to walk through rooms that would crumble without their contributions. Every year, the state subsidizes operations, taxpayers funding preservation whether they visit or not, whether they value heritage or wish the money went elsewhere. The beauty endures, but endurance requires constant negotiation, continuous compromise between ideal preservation and practical reality. The palace stands as monument to several truths simultaneously. It demonstrates what human beings can create when resources and power align, the extraordinary beauty possible when craftsmen of genius receive patronage equal to their abilities. It reveals the costs of such creation, the labor and sacrifice that beauty requires, the ongoing commitment necessary to prevent decay. It shows how survival requires adaptation, how institutions persist by changing, by accepting new purposes, by transforming from private residences into public museums, from symbols of absolute power into cultural heritage sites managed democratically. Walk through the palace today, and you experience layers of time compressed into continuous present. The stone cut in the 18th century stands beside electrical conduits installed last decade. Tiepolo's frescoes glow under LED lighting that mimics candlelight while consuming a fraction of the energy. Gardens designed for aristocratic leisure now accommodate crowds moving along prescribed routes. Tour guides narrate histories to visitors wearing headphones, their voices transmitted wirelessly through spaces once filled with whispered intrigues and ceremonial proclamations. The palace contains multitudes, all the intentions and purposes that have accumulated across 3 centuries, none entirely erasing those that came before. The cost of maintaining this palimpsest runs to millions annually, a figure that provokes both pride and criticism depending on perspective. Supporters argue that the palace represents irreplaceable heritage, a window into artistic achievement and historical experience, its value transcending mere economics. Critics counter that no building should consume such resources, that historical significance does not justify public subsidy, that money would better serve living needs rather than preserving monuments to dead monarchs. The debate persists because both positions contain truth. The palace is magnificent and wasteful, inspiring and expensive, a treasure and a burden. The workers who maintain the palace rarely participate in these debates. They simply do the work, understanding that arguments about value and priority matter less than the daily reality that stone erodes, plaster cracks, fabric fades, and gardens require continuous care. A conservator repairing damage to a ceiling does not ask whether the ceiling deserves preservation. The task is to preserve it according to best practice, applying skill and knowledge to a problem that has a solution, even if that solution is temporary, even if the same ceiling will require attention again in another decade. The work is its own justification, meaningful because it connects present to past, because it maintains possibilities for future generations who will make their own decisions about what matters, what to preserve, what to let go. The palace reveals what all great monuments eventually teach. Beauty alone does not survive. Admiration does not prevent decay. Good intentions do not maintain roofs or repair foundations. Survival requires resources, continuous allocation of money and labor, willingness to compromise between preservation and practicality. Every generation must choose again whether to continue paying the costs, whether the value received justifies the value expended, whether heritage matters enough to divert resources from other purposes. Spain has chosen repeatedly across centuries to preserve the palace, but this choice has never been comfortable or unanimous. It represents accommodation between competing values, a decision to maintain connection with history while questioning what that history represents, to preserve beauty created under conditions modernity rightly rejects, to find meaning in monuments built by systems built on inequality and exploitation. The palace cannot be innocent. Its grandeur depended on structures that demanded submission and extracted labor. Yet the palace also transcends those origins, becoming something more than the intentions of its creators, a space where contemporary visitors encounter artistic achievement that speaks across centuries, that demonstrates human capacity for creating beauty even within systems of profound injustice. The central paradox remains unresolved and probably unresolvable. The palace exists because absolute monarchs commanded resources sufficient to build it. No democratic society would allocate this much wealth to a single building, yet democratic Spain now preserves and maintains what monarchy created, finding contemporary value in historical grandeur. The palace serves purposes its builders never imagined, educational and cultural functions that justify continued investment. Yet the building forever carries the mark of its origins, the weight of all the labor and sacrifice required to raise it from stone and imagination into reality. The dream was never one person's. Philip V initiated construction but died before it was half finished. Charles III shaped its completion and operation, but could not have built it alone. Sacchetti designed it, but needed Tiepolo, Mengs, and dozens of other artists to realize his vision. Every person who contributed labor, from master craftsmen to anonymous workers hauling stone, became part of the dream, whether they wished to or not, whether they benefited or merely survived. The dream accumulated, layer upon layer, decade upon decade, until it achieved a kind of independence, existing beyond any individual's intentions, demanding continuation regardless of who claimed authority. What does it cost to keep the dream alive today? 40 million euros annually, measured in currency. Careers spent in conservation, measured in human dedication. Ongoing debates about public funding, measured in political capital. Continuous decisions about what to preserve and what to change, measured in cultural values. The costs are real and multiple, financial and intellectual and social. But the alternative is abandonment, accepting that such monuments cannot survive changing conditions, that historical beauty must yield to contemporary priorities. Perhaps someday this choice will be made, resources redirected to more immediate needs, the palace left to elegant decay. But for now, the work continues, the palace endures, and visitors still walk through throne rooms beneath painted skies, encountering beauty that required centuries of labor to create and requires continuous labor to preserve. If preserving great monuments requires allocating resources that could address urgent contemporary needs, at what point does heritage become a luxury we can no longer afford? Or does maintaining connections to beauty and history remain essential precisely when other pressures seem overwhelming?